Disneyland is your land. Here age relives fond memories of the past, and here youth may savor the challenge and promise of the future.
Think about the man who said those words, standing in front of the world, in front of the place he had spent everything to build, the place that 302 people had told him would never work, the place his own brother had refused to believe in, the place he had mortgaged everything for, his studio, his savings, his reputation, just to prove that a dream could become something real. And here he was, on that stage, welcoming the world to something nobody thought possible. But before this moment, before the castle, before the magic, before any of it, there was a boy who woke up at 3 a.m. to deliver newspapers in the dark and dreamed of building a place where nobody would ever feel small again. This is that story. But this isn't just a story about someone who built something big. Those stories exist everywhere. This one is different because most people who face failure once adjust. They find something safer, something more realistic, something the world is willing to accept. He failed completely, more than once, in more ways than most people could survive, and every single time, he built again. Not a smaller version, not a safer version, something bigger, something nobody had ever seen. And here's what nobody talks about when they tell his story. The failures weren't detours, they were the education. Every bankruptcy, every stolen character, every employee who walked out, every investor who said no. All of it was building something inside him that couldn't be built any other way. But before you can understand what he became, you need to understand where he started. And where he started was about as far from magic as you can get. Before anyone knew his name, he was just a boy who saw the world differently than everyone around him. Born in Chicago in 1901, the fourth son of a restless father who moved the family from city to city, chasing work that never quite paid enough. His father was strict, demanding, the kind of man who believed that hardship built character and made sure his children had plenty of both. From the age of 8, was waking up at 3 a.m. to help deliver newspapers in the cold Kansas City dark. His father took all the money, but found a way. He worked extra routes in secret, saved what he could, used every spare cent to buy pencils and paper. Because from the moment he could hold a crayon, drawing was the only thing that made sense to him. He drew on everything: paper, walls, once with resin and a stick on the side of his parents' house. The punishment that followed didn't stop him. Nothing stopped him. At school, he was the class cartoonist. At home, he was the dreamer nobody quite knew what to do with. And then one day, walking through a wealthy neighborhood in Kansas City, he saw something he had never seen before. A mansion with a garden and a high fence, and everything inside it that a boy from a poor family could only imagine. He stood at that fence for a long time and made himself a promise. One day, he would build a place like that, but not just for himself, for everyone, a place where nobody had to stand on the outside looking in. That promise would take 40 years to keep, and everything that happened in between would almost break him before it made him. And the breaking started early. After World War I, he returned to Kansas City with nothing but ambition and a second-hand camera. he started a small animation studio with a friend. They worked day and night. They believed in what they were building. And then the distributor they trusted with their films stopped paying. The studio went bankrupt. He was 21 years old. He had no money, no job, no plan, just a suitcase, a one-way ticket to Hollywood, and an unfinished film he refused to throw away. He arrived in California with $40 in his pocket and started again. With his brother by his side, he built a new studio from a single garage, and slowly, painfully, it started to work. He created a character that audiences loved, a rabbit, cheerful, energetic, irresistible. Distributors wanted more. The future finally looked possible. And then the distributor called him into a meeting and told him that the character didn't belong to him. The contract he had signed without reading carefully enough had given the rights to someone else, not just the character. His entire animation team gone. He boarded a train back to Hollywood with nothing again, but on that train, staring out the window at the passing landscape, he started sketching. A mouse, cheerful, resilient, impossible to defeat. The little mouse nobody expected would become the most recognizable animal character in the history of entertainment. And the studio grew, a full-length animated film that the entire industry called impossible, made audiences cry and cheer and stand up in their seats. Everything seemed possible. And then the strike. Nearly half his animation team walked out. The people he had called his family, the people he had tried to protect, gone. The studio's stock collapsed. The films began to lose money. He fell into a depression so deep that he fled to South America just to escape it. He wrote that he was disappointed, confused, broken by what had happened. And when he came back, he was different. The man who had wanted to be everyone's friend had learned that the world doesn't always want what you're offering. But the dream was still there, burning quietly, waiting. And then the dream took a new shape. It started with a train, a miniature railway he built in his own backyard, riding it on weekends, escaping into something simple and joyful after years of complexity and pain. And one afternoon, sitting on that train, the memory came back. The mansion, the fence, the boy who stood outside looking in, and the promise he had made. He wanted to build that place. Not a studio, not a cartoon, a real place where families could come together, where children could meet the characters they loved, where nobody stood on the outside, a ball. And the world said no. Not once, not 10 times, 302 times. 302 investors looked at his dream and turned him down. They called it unrealistic, too expensive, too risky. Even his brother, the one person who had stood by him through every bankruptcy, every stolen character, every strike, shook his head. This time, even he wasn't sure. And he had a choice: stop or spend everything. He chose everything. He mortgaged his own house, borrowed against his life insurance, sold his vacation home. He put every single thing he had into a plot of land in California and started building the place he had promised that boy at the fence he would one day create. And on a warm July morning in 1955, he stood on a stage in front of the world and spoke the words that opened everything. And the man who stood on that stage on that warm July morning in 1955, who had gone bankrupt at 21, who had his most beloved character stolen, who had watched half his team walk out, who had been rejected 302 times for his greatest dream, who had mortgaged his house, his insurance, everything he had, to build a place he had promised a little boy at a fence he would one day create, wasn't just anyone. That man was Walt Disney. And that warm July morning in 1955 changed everything. The park opened its gates and the world walked in. Within 6 months, 1 million people had come to see what 302 investors had called impossible. Within a year, it was the most visited attraction in the world. The little boy who had stood at a fence and dreamed of building something magical had done exactly that. But it wasn't just a park. It was proof. Proof that the failures hadn't been the end of the story. Proof that bankruptcy at 21 doesn't define you. Proof that losing your characters, your team, your savings doesn't mean losing the dream. The studio that had nearly collapsed in the strike of 1941 became one of the most powerful entertainment companies in the history of the world. The mouse he sketched on a train ride home from the worst meeting of his life became the most recognizable fictional character on the planet. The full-length animated film the entire industry said was impossible spawned a legacy of stories that would touch every generation that came after. And Walt, the boy who drew on walls and woke up at 3 in the morning to deliver papers in the dark, collected more Academy Awards than any individual in the history of cinema. Not because the world had always believed in him, but because he had never stopped believing in himself, even when everyone else did. And through all of it, he never forgot where the dream had come from. Not from success, not from recognition, not from the awards, from a boy at a fence, from a promise made in the cold Kansas City dark, from a father who was hard and demanding and took every dollar he earned, but also, without knowing it, gave him something that no amount of money could buy. The understanding that nothing worth having comes easy. And so when the park finally opened, when the gates swung wide and the families walked through, he didn't stand there thinking about the 302 rejections. He stood there thinking about all the children who would never have to stand at a fence looking in. Because the fence was gone. He had taken it down himself. But there was one person who never got to see it. His mother. She had died years before, in the house he had built for her, in a tragic accident that he never fully forgave himself for. And some who knew him best believed that every story he ever told, every mother lost too soon, every small creature who needed protecting, carried something of her in it. Because that's what grief does when it has nowhere else to go. It becomes art. And his art touched the entire world. There's a version of this story where he stops at the first bankruptcy, where the stolen character is the last straw, where the strike breaks him for good, where the 302nd rejection is the one that finally wins. That version almost happened more than once, but every single time the world said no, he went back to the drawing board, literally, because that's who he was, not someone who needed the world's permission to keep going, someone who understood that the dream was worth more than the comfort of giving up. So, if you're at your own fence right now, looking at something you can't yet reach, if the bankruptcies are stacking up, if the people you trusted have walked away, if the world has said no so many times you've lost count, remember this: 302 people said no to the happiest place on earth. And he built it anyway. Sometimes the place that breaks you open is exactly where the real story begins. That's the story of Walt Disney. This is Before They Knew. See you next time.